Hey, folks, it's Rick Wilson from the Lincoln Project Podcast. I hope you are all having a splendid day. We are out in Chicago right now. It has been an amazing event so far. The the energy level you're hearing about on the news and seeing online, it's like a tenth of what's happening here. It is really exciting. Folks are pumped up. Joe Biden gave a hell of a speech last night. I'm recording this on Tuesday. He gave a hell of a speech last night, blew the roof off, made the best case against Trump I think I've heard anybody make in a long time. And it is just an exciting event. So if you check out Lincoln Project's socials and our YouTube page right now, we are pumping out a tremendous amount of video content from the event. I think you'll really enjoy it. We're having some great fun out here talking to folks and getting a real sense of where the party is and where the campaign is that I think you'll find very valuable. Stephen Ujlaki is the director of a documentary called Bad Faith, which I absolutely must insist you go out and find and watch. It is compelling and terrifying and important all at the same time, and it is a great conversation. Anyway, folks, we will be talking to you again very soon. And again, check out our YouTube channel and our socials. We are putting out a tremendous amount of stuff from the convention. A whole lot of the LP team is out here on the ground, and we are interacting with folks every day. And I've been to a lot of conventions, y'all. This one is really exciting.
Your task will not be an easy one. Your enemy is well-trained, well-equipped, and battle-hardened.
There is not a liberal America and a conservative America. There is the United States of America.
Good night and good luck.
Hey, folks, it's Rick Wilson. Welcome back to the Lincoln Project Podcast. My guest today is Stephen Ujlaki. He is the producer of a new documentary called Bad Faith. If you haven't seen it, go watch it. It is riveting. It is dark. It will give you a glimpse into the secret underbelly behind so much of the politics you see in this country today on the right. And that is the rise and control of that almost entire movement by Christian nationalism. Stephen, thank you so much for coming on the podcast today. I really appreciate you joining us. I think that the reporting in Bad Faith, even as someone who came out of the right, I was never an evangelical. So I always had a firewall, a distance between myself and that part of the world. And while I knew it existed, while I understood its power, I didn't have as clear a view of it as you were able to pull out in the course of this documentary. Tell us about the origin story of how you came to make Bad Faith, and give people an understanding of just how big and how powerful and how pervasive that element of evangelical political activism is in the country today.
Okay. The reason I got into this is that I was shocked by the election of Trump in 2016. Nothing I read, nobody I talked to, anything I heard or seen gave me any clue that this could happen. Then when it happened, I realized, hey, wait a minute, I'm in a bubble. I'm in the classic liberal bubble. And I stepped down as dean 2018, and I started researching the evangelicals because they were the reason he got elected. And initially I thought, gee, there must be a way to get the progressive evangelicals and the conservatives together because after all, Jesus sort of unites them. Then, of course, I realized how completely naive that was, that they didn't even preach Jesus in the extremist churches. Jesus was useful only as a kind of a hood ornament. Anyway, a bunch of books came out by Catherine Stewart and also Ann Nelson, Sam Perry, about Christian nationalism. And nobody had really talked much about it. When I asked people like Franklin Graham, they said, no, it's the left, it's a hoax. It's the leftists. They came up with it to try to make it look bad, doesn't exist. But what I found out about it was this incredible story of this guy, Paul Weyrich, who was absolutely determined to give the Republicans the kind of edge that the Democrats had through the unions. He was determined to use the churches, the evangelical churches, as basically bought votes that they could count on, and that was how they were going to win elections, because they were a minority otherwise. And the story of Weyrich and how he convinced these people and all the efforts he made to try to get them to get into politics, it was quite funny. Unfortunately, it can't be in the film, but he spent years trying to get them. Years. He got pornography, prayer in schools, all these other. It was only when their tax-exempt status was threatened by the Supreme Court, Green versus Connolly, that they freaked out because they were making a lot of money on these academies, which of course came about because instead of integration in the South, white people, kids, they pulled the kids out of the schools and put them into these Christian academies, who then had tax-exempt status. And of course, when the Supreme Court said that no institution that is discriminatory can qualify as a nonprofit, they freaked out. They went along with what Weyrich wanted. Finally, the big problem, though, was you can't talk. The banner of segregation forever was not going to be that successful in building a grassroots. So Weyrich, smart that he was this extremist Catholic. He knew about the whole abortion thing. He knew that Catholics had a really strong reaction to the whole abortion issue. And he was able to convince the evangelicals that they should be against abortion too. Even though in 1973, after Roe versus Wade came out, they were the Baptist Convention. I'm forgetting the name now. The supreme body. They thought it was great. They applauded it, and Falwell for years didn't speak against it because the evangelicals were not against it. Weyrich said, "Look, this moral majority is only going to work if we have something that we and you evangelicals and we Catholics share being against." Okay. And that had to be abortion.
Right.
And so they went along with it. And it was a business deal that came out, tremendously successful.
And it did begin to become a pillar of the Republicans in the late 70s, early 80s, when you also had another emergent technological development. And that was that guys like Weyrich understood the power of computer-driven mailing lists.
Yeah.
And folks, if you ever get a piece of mail from a politician that has 17 pages and bold text and fake circles with highlighter and all the scare text, you are seeing the grandchild or great-grandchild of Paul Weyrich's innovation in political life. But the Christian nationalists and the moral majority were some of the first to really harness that, correct?
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, I was trying to figure out how did it happen that they were able to inculcate Christian nationalism amongst these churchgoers who were basically Christians who were going to church and all of this. How did this happen? And what I began to realize, the more deeply I got into that world, and it is an alternate universe, which is very hard to understand. Makes no sense if you're outside it. For example, if a pastor was saying that the goal was to recreate the kingdom of God on earth, you might have thought as an outsider he was talking about something spiritual. No, they were actually talking about replacing democracy with a form of theocracy. And you have people who for year after year after year, this ideology was being preached from the altars, and the end result is you had this groundswell. I mean, we finally culminated in the Tea Party. The Tea Party was the result very often of these radicalized evangelicals supported by Koch money who basically white lash against Obama. But this was the first big manifestation that really jostled, as you know, the Republican Party. And ultimately that group took it over. Weyrich was furious at the Republicans for not doing what he wanted. He was furious at the Republicans for using the evangelicals and not doing. And this was ultimately where we are now is Weyrich's revenge. Really, they've taken over the party.
So Weyrich went out. He ended up having a lot of this money out there. The methodologies of keeping these evangelicals motivated and captivated in the Republican Party began to be understood by guys like me. We knew how to scare them. We knew how to push their buttons. and we knew how to keep them in line. I came from the establishment part of the Republican Party, the Bush
Yeah.
wing, if you want to call it that.
Yeah. Yeah.
And every cycle, we knew we had to get the three legs of the Republican stool lined up. Foreign policy conservatives, guys like me, economic
Yeah.
conservatives, mostly guys like me, and the evangelical social conservatives, not guys
Yeah.
like me. We understood how to talk to those people, but Weyrich became increasingly discontent. Reagan was too far to the left for Weyrich by
Yeah.
far. Bush was, I can tell you folks very directly, having worked for George H.W. Bush, Paul Weyrich loathed him, thought
Sure.
he was an elitist, New England liberal, everything. So they realized over time that they had this giant pool of money they were sitting on. So groups funded by the Kochs on the economic side, they had this unholy marriage between the economic conservatives and the social conservatives. And talk about how that builds the Council of National Policy and what it becomes in our politics, because you could ask 1 million Americans and 5 of them are going to know what it is.
Well, that's the great mystery. Ann Nelson wrote this terrific book,
Yep.
Shadow Network. And she said, even after the book was published and she was going around talking to Washington Hands and people, they ignored it. They said, no, if we don't know about it, it doesn't exist. You're giving it far too much importance. She spent years researching how Weyrich, after Reagan nominated Sandra Day O'Connor to the Supreme Court, violating the platform pledge that they were going to, they had to be an anti-abortion nominee for the Supreme Court, he created the Council of National Policy. He got oil and gas billionaire money behind it to promote their economic and political desires, which is no regulation, no taxes. There was the cover of the church. Now we had the evangelicals who were saying, okay, they were Christians and we want to do this for God. It was actually a brilliant scheme. It was something that a number of people at the time said, hey, wait a minute, this is a violation of church and state. And Norman Lear put out a PSA about it, which was to make fun of it. You had different people saying, hey, wait a minute, this isn't right. This hasn't happened before. But it was successful. It got Reagan elected. It worked. And what was interesting, and you know more about this than I do from on the inside, was the fact that Weyrich, even though he was basically castigated as a guy of fringe that they didn't want to have to deal with,
Right.
He ended up, basically those crazies ended up taking over the Republican Party, crazily enough. And it was because of I would call it the Christian nationalist base that had been created over the years by that alliance that did it. And it was all happening invisibly, if you will, to anybody who was outside that. And the power of it is enormous.
It is that very stealthiness, and I can tell you there was a thing I would say in 2009 or early 2010, someone inside CNP asked me to prepare a briefing for some people at CNP to pitch them a piece of business, and they send me this non-disclosure agreement that is like I am selling my damn soul, and I was like, what is this all about? I made a few phone calls. And people were like, yeah, it's really good if you get tied into it financially, but here's what it really is. And I was like, I don't think I'll be able to do this. And it wasn't like I had some giant moral revelation about who they were. It was just like that much NDA stuff and that much secrecy always leads me when I was a consultant to think something shady is going on here. I don't know what it is, and I didn't know what it was.
Yeah.
But as I've come to understand the scope of it, they do have to hide what they're doing. They do have to keep it.
And they have very successfully
at
the point you were making about NDAs and so forth. They were so successful. You couldn't say you were a member. They never announced the meetings that they had. You couldn't say anything about it. We managed to get some video from a guy who's sort of an expert at pulling stuff out that he got.
Yeah.
But basically, it's incredibly powerful, and people did not pay attention to it, but it put all the pieces together in a way very much advancing Weyrich's agenda. And, he died a month after Obama was election. Some people said that's what killed him. But, he was he was not doing well before that.
He was, yeah, I was gonna say he was pretty ill for a while before
Yeah.
that. But
Yeah.
so the moment where the Christian right, the Christian nationalist right, has had its greatest triumph was with their Cyrus, Donald Trump. They managed to find someone who they all realized on the front end wasn't just not like them, but was anathema to everything they believed. He is a whoremonger, an adulterer, a liar, a thief, a fraud, a man with no religious beliefs whatsoever. And yet he has become, in the minds of these people, essentially sent to them by God in their minds to save America. What does it say about the evangelical movement and about this Christian nationalist movement that Trump is so far away from their stated beliefs and their asserted beliefs as to be? It's unimaginable how distant that space is. What does it say about who they are, that they have decided that they're going to bet the farm forever on this guy?
Yeah, well, it's Paula White, who was a Pentecostalist. And, the low end of the ladder, the people higher up didn't invite to dinner, even though they were members of the family, because there was the snake stuff and the talking words and all that. She's the one. She was Trump's entry into that world.
Right.
And she started spreading the word that he'd become a Christian. Well, that didn't really fly. So they came up with, again, you have to talk about, okay, the ingenuity of the evangelicals. You've got the Bible. Well, the Bible, there's lots of stuff in the Bible. There's also this guy, King Cyrus. He was a pagan, but God used this pagan to help the Jews. And so God will use people, even if they are not holy people or people who are on his side. And some genius came up with this. And Elizabeth Newman is a very, very bright, talented woman who's in the film, was describing how that turned the corner for them. When she said that people were holding their nose about Trump because he was anathema to them, to the realization, wait a minute, we could be living out the scriptures. This is exactly, unbeknownst to us, God works in very mysterious ways. And that's what's happening. Now, you want to call that what you will, whether it's like rampant opportunism, complete I don't know, fill in the blank. I mean, you cannot, all I know is that they've been incredibly pragmatic behind this, and and they essentially think that the end justifies the means. So they are willing to totally distort the religion in order to supposedly get goals that frankly are of benefit to their leaders and certainly not to the followers.
That's always fascinated me about this, because I have a very close friend who is a good-hearted, faithful Southern Baptist evangelical, not an evil streak, and not really a politicized or political person.
Yeah.
And he said to me once, he goes, the pastor industrial complex has gotten bigger and bigger and bigger all the time. And that word, the pastor industrial complex, you profile some of those people in the film. You show some of those people in the film, Pastor Paula and Joel Osteen, and all these prosperity gospel guys out there who have become wildly wealthy in this era, who have these audiences that are deeply entertained by the showmanship of their version of Christianity, which I think kind of overlaps with Trump. There were people in the Republican Party who were not engaged in Republican politics, but they loved the show of Trump.
Absolutely, that they will recognize the fellow showman. And you're putting your finger on something really important. The pastor industrial complex, the people who made a fortune out of this alliance with the Republicans, like Falwell, Robertson, and all the others, and Osteen, and all the rest that followed,
Right.
They are the ones who are controlling. And you have a situation, Rick, where these people believe everything that their pastor tells them. When somebody asked, I think it was a Bill Moyer's interview, or not in the film, somebody says, do your people follow what you say? They said, yes, absolutely. The guy said, that's a lot of power. And Falbo says, yes. They have an enormous power, which they have abused. They've exploited their position. They've made fortunes on this, and they are running the show. And you had a situation like the Watchman on the Wall. You have Tony Perkins. These guys, they've all made a fortune off of this.
Will you explain Watchman on the Wall? Because you touch on it in the film, and it's another one of these things. The Seven Mountains Doctrine and the Watchman on the Wall, I think, are two things that people could really benefit from having a greater understanding of.
Okay, Watchman on the Wall essentially provides financial benefits to pastors who are willing to follow the script and play ball and be part of that network. They supply them visual material, they supply them script, they supply them entertainers, they supply them, you name it. If you're playing ball, if you go along with what they're doing, you are in the club and you benefit mightily from Watchmen on the Wall.
Right.
And this very sanctimonious Tony Perkins, the same thing as Mike Johnson, they all look like Sunday school teachers, but in fact, they're vicious extremists hiding behind that. Okay, so that's Watchmen on the Wall. Seven Mountains, we talk about it in the film. Rousas Rushdoony, who was the apologist scholar behind the notion of how are you going to Christianize America, came up with Seven Mountains Dominionism. Okay, there are the seven pillars: family, education, business, entertainment, politics. And what you see today happening with the Republicans taking over, the ballot boxes, taking over election polls, all at that level, they are following the concept of taking power by taking territory. And you've got like a guy like Paul Lance Wallnow, who's a kind of self-described prophet, basically telling them, this is what as Christians you need to do. God and Jesus have asked you to take dominion of the land. And so they're literally doing this stuff. It's the same thing I said earlier about recreating the kingdom of God on earth. No, you're actually physically going to do this. This is not a spiritual thing. And of course, that's the great heresy as far as people like Russell Moore and progressive evangelicals and others, that this is a complete, absolute disgrace and a heresy. And it's causing a lot of people to leave the church. A lot of young people to leave the church.
It is fascinating to me that there is such an overlap of the money, the malice, the influence, and the operational ability to deliver this enormous set of messages. I mean, they have a media infrastructure, right, that is much bigger than people think in terms of being able to reach their audiences.
Even when the film was in its early stages and I was showing it to people like Fred Weissman or Ken Burns or different friends of mine, Rob Reiner, he said, boy, I didn't realize they were this powerful. This is really scary. Even before I had all the edits figured out and all this, the narration, the structure, nailing down their organization is enormous. I mean, it's absolutely enormous. And again, it's one of those things that's invisible if you're not in that world. That's the thing that's so difficult about it. You can't. So it's very easy for people to think that it doesn't exist or to minimize it or to think, as many people do on both coasts, that the people in the middle maybe are not this not together enough, and they're not really, it's not that important about what they're doing. Of course, the election of Trump showed that wasn't right.
That idea that this is a common, and I've told my Democratic friends about this 100 times, it is a common misconception that because a lot of the people involved in this movement believe something you believe differently in terms of their religious beliefs, or that they are, not from a coastal city, that they're all rubes and hicks and back in the sticks.
Yeah.
And there are very sophisticated people behind this, incredibly smart people behind this. There are people with a malicious amount of intent and energy pushing this. And I just find it fascinating that we have taken it so lightly for so long.
You know, Rick, this is one of the biggest problems that I'm glad you brought that up, because even with what the film is showing, it seems to be incredibly difficult to convince people that there is a sizable minority of Americans who are against democracy and to want to bring it down. And as you say, they're not rubes. They're very wealthy. They're very well educated. We have a person who was an expert on the KKK in the 1920s who said people had the same reaction, that the KKK, oh, they must be a bunch of rubes. No, she said they were amongst the highest levels in the land, people who were part of the KKK in the 1920s. So too for the Trump, and you've got a situation which is, it's very self-defeating to think that your opponents are not that smart or and that you're superior to them. It's a sure recipe for getting defeated by them. And I think the mainstream media is reluctant to show the extent of it. It's almost like it's too radical a thought for them to imagine that people are actually trying to take down democracy. You've got the New York Times. You can imagine what a headline would be if something drastic happened. If there's a fire that took place, well, there was a little smoke in the garage. Nobody,
Right.
everything is minimizing and normalizing. And so you have that working against people understanding it. It really is, people like yourself and people like, or, hopefully in the film, will understand this is real and it's dangerous and there's a lot of them and they actually hate democracy and they think they're somehow going to benefit when an autocracy, a Christian elite, is put in its place. How they think that's going to happen, how they think they're going to benefit, how they think that have they really thought this through? Do they really want to be like Russia or Turkey or Iran? I really cannot understand. What is it going to take to make people realize how serious this is? Even Trump says you don't have to vote a second time, just vote once.
That was my next question. What do you think the reaction was among that community a couple of weeks ago when he says, Christians, you've got to get out and vote this time. You won't ever have to vote again. I don't think they heard that as a joke or a prank or something funny. I think they heard that as a promise of a future that they really want.
Absolutely. And see, that's exactly the way to look at it. If you looked at it in another way, you would think you would minimize it. Mm-hmm. But you're looking at it the right way. You're looking at it the way they get it. They get exactly what he's saying. And you're not going to get the mainstream media to get it that way. So they're going to always minimize it. So people like us spending our time trying to say, hey, wait, this is really, really serious. And we're not getting enough corroboration from some of the sources that these people count on.
When you look at a lot of the belief structure on January 6th, you saw these people who were carrying flags and signs about Jesus and about Trump being sent by God. And how deeply embedded in this movement now is a sense of permission to use violence against your political opponents?
Right, completely. I mean, for him to say that these people were patriots, that he would excuse them, that he would. I mean, everything he has said is painting a picture of exactly what he would do if he got back into power. It's also painting a picture of how they see January 6th and all those different attempts to undermine democracy. And we continue to report it like these are not that consequential. It's almost like some kind of quirk of Trump. It's not a quirk. He's sending signals. He's sending signals and people. Yeah, exactly. He's sending signals and people go, hey, wake up, group. Wake up, everybody. He's telling you and this is what I understood in the years of doing research on the film, they believe absolutely they have every right to demolish the government because the government is satanic. It's against Jesus. It's against God. They bought all this bullshit and they're, and in Trump, they found the perfect showman opportunist who was created by Christian nationalism and who figured he auditioned for the part with the whole birtherism thing. And now it's also an uneasy alliance because this guy is like all over the place and he's not exactly on script. And I think they're afraid he's going to fuck things up for them. in the same
Well,
way
I
that
will say this.
yeah,
I will say this. There's some rumbling out there because say what you will about Donald Trump. He's not a smart man. Okay. We all know he's not a smart, educated guy, but Trump is cunning. He's very, very cunning. He has a very keen sense of things that can hurt him personally or politically.
yeah,
And right now, he knows that the Dobbs decision is pure political poison. He knows it's hurting him. He knows all the Republican abortion actions in the states, which the CNP folks, if you want to run it back to where do
yeah,
they get the language for all these abortion bills, it's
right,
all these groups around CNP that produce this kind of material for them.
right,
They do
right,
what they call model legislation and send it out to the
yeah,
state.
yeah,
But
yeah.
Trump knows how much that is hurting him politically.
And Project 2025, Rick, the same thing. It's hurting him
Yep.
in the same way.
Yep, exactly right. Exactly right. And by the way, folks, you will find if you dig the hole deep enough, you will find overlap of the Project 2025 writers to groups that are part of the CNP and people from the CNP. And you
Absolutely,
will find
absolutely.
this Christian nationalism. It is woven through the DNA of all this authoritarian populism and all this authoritarian nationalism. And look, maybe people like Bannon don't believe in it, but they'll use it.
Yeah. Oh, yeah.
And
Yeah.
and at the end, I see a possibility of a rift there because he's backing away from the anti-abortion stuff because he knows it's politically costing him.
Yeah. Yeah.
My question is, do they think he's just going to flip back if he gets reelected and do what they want again?
Absolutely, he's going to do what they want.
I believe that too. I'm
Absolutely.
curious
You know
if
what? They've cut the measure of this guy. They know who they're in business with. Okay, it's mutual use. The bad news is what we know. The good news is the guy has no principles. He's not
None.
interested in governing. He's
None.
very happy to say, here's the keys to the store. It's what he did over the first term. He let all the evangelicals in and let them do what they wanted to do, all the appointees that they wanted. He doesn't give a shit about that. And they're perfectly happy and now poised to really do what they wanted to do in the last couple of months after he lost the election in 2020. And frankly, the fact that he continues to admit to say that he won the election and all these Republicans are going along with that. I mean, it's been said before, but it's absolutely disgusting.
As a former Republican, I tell people this all the time. Leaving a party that doesn't believe in any of the things that you claim to believe in is not a shameful act. It's a proud act. You should be proud of getting out of it. But so I want to wrap up with one final thing. What do you think happens to this movement if Trump is defeated this fall? Because it strikes me that there's now an awareness level among enough folks out there on the Democratic side that this is a serious challenge, and you can't just ignore it and pretend it's just a bunch of snake dancing goons in a wood church down in Arkansas.
Okay, that's a good question because my fear is that if Harris wins, and of course I hope that she will, that the Democrats don't feel, okay, game one, we can go home now. It's the day after, and the fact that these people play the long game, they're not going to give up.
The longest. Mm-hmm.
The longest game. The longest game. This goes back 40, 50 years. They're very patient, step by step, little incremental steps. Whereas the Democrats have essentially ceded the state level for years. They weren't paying attention to it. Obama wasn't paying attention to the buildup of party structure. Right. I'm very worried about what's going to happen. Trump is going to say that he won. There's going to be violence. Of people who are the constitutional sheriffs, people who are his backers in the military and various other places are going to be
QAnon weirdo world.
Absolutely. All that's going to come into play. They're going to try to do successfully what they didn't do in 2020. We're going to see a replay of that. So I'm very scared of that. And it's extremely important that the Democrats and people who want to defend democracy realize the work is only going to begin again.
That's right.
The day after the election. That's the message that I really want to get out there. They're not giving up. They're not going to give up ever. They believe that God is on their side. However fucked up they actually are, that we think, they believe it, when they're willing to kill and do violence in behalf of that. So that's the day after.
Folks, thank you, Stephen, for joining us today on the Lincoln Project podcast. Folks, the film is Bad Faith. You can watch it on Amazon, Apple, Google Play, YouTube, all over the place. I strongly, strongly, strongly recommend it. It will open your eyes to the depth of what we are facing in the pro-democracy movement, because these people are some of the best organized, most ill-intended groups and individuals in the fight against us. It's important to understand who the enemy is, and these folks are an enemy of freedom. And again, thank you, Stephen, for coming on the podcast today. Really appreciate you.
Absolutely. Look, if I may say, if people want a Bad Faith documentary, if they want to host a screening, if they want to find out how to see it, we're
Great.
having all over the country. We're having people having screenings at the local churches, at the local theaters, because when they see the film, they're excited. They want to make sure other people see it. So thank you for this opportunity, Rick. I'm a
Great
big
having
fan
you
of your
on.
show. So
Thank you. Thank you so
Okay.
much.
All right.
All right.
Bye-bye.
Good night and good luck.